The 1970s and 80s. Staten Island, New York City, New York. When we often talk about urban legends, we associate them with things that go bump in the night. The cliche killers that show up at the places your parents tell you not to go as a kid, or the fantastical beasts residing in the deep dark forests all over the world. However, lying deep within the former old forests of the heart of Staten Island resides a legend rooted in the hearts of children and the residents of Staten Island for decades. The legend about an escaped mental patient stalking the underground tunnels of the old state school and kidnapping kids who dared venture into his territory, sometimes regarded with a hook for a hand or wielding a bloody axe. This legend is known as Cropsey. And unlike many urban legends, this one is all too real. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a true-life urban legend, one in which might be rooted in fiction, but when children mysteriously started vanishing on Staten Island, the legend of Cropsey became real. Today we explore the real-life counterpart, terror, and legend of Cropsey, the Staten Island Boogeyman. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you were listening to this show, first I want to say thank you for checking this show out. Thank you for checking out my content. If you happen to be listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out tremendously, and I can't thank you enough. While you're there as well, feel free to follow me ahead on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown and TikTok at the same handle as well. Check me all out there, and I greatly appreciate it. However, today on the show, I wanted to go back to being spooky. Now, with Halloween being right on the doorstep, I wanted to, again, go back down the realm of something spooky, something scary, and really get into the Halloween spirit. Now, this originally led me down to thinking of something maybe true crime related for this week's episode, and I started looking and heading down some rabbit holes, and eventually I stumbled upon this topic and this legend, and it was very intriguing to me, and it piqued my interest right away as a topic for this week, in that it had this perfect blend of spooky urban legend, but also true crime to go along with it, and I just had to cover it on what technically would be our Halloween episode for this year. Now, technically, this will be my third year doing a Halloween episode for you all, and to be honest, that is really crazy to think about, that once upon a time, I had this idea and this dream to do this show, and to be able to stay with it for this long and consistently, I really enjoy it. I really enjoy doing all of this for you, and I really appreciate all of you who have listened and supported the show over this long period now. It means a lot to me, more than I can even put into words, and just that being said, I have to say thank you. But with that all out of the way, and the sentimental part of the episode out of the way, let's talk about how this episode is going to go today. First, I want to go over the Cropsey legend and what inspired it, along with some background about the area of Staten Island, and then go into the true life crimes that have become associated with the legend and the person who would go on to commit these crimes. Now, it is a very full episode for you all today, and I hope you all enjoy it. However, before we dive into the episode itself, a big chunk of my research was done for this week's episode through the documentary aptly titled Cropsey by Joshua Zeman and Barbara Brancasio. Now, this is an excellent documentary, and it came out back in 2009, and I encourage anybody who wants to watch this documentary, I definitely suggest go check it out. It is very, very good. However, it is graphic and disturbing at parts, and just kind of take that portion of a grain of salt. That in the documentary is set within the backdrop of the 2004 trial regarding the kidnapping and murder of Holly Ann Hughes that we will also discuss in this episode. Just for a little context for those of you who want to go out and watch the documentary, like I said, very, very good. I highly encourage you to do so. However, there are some parts that are a little disturbing, just to throw that out there. Now, the legend of Cropsey itself seems to have no root origin story. Many tales of Cropsey either involve that of a man named George Cropsey, who, depending on the story, was a deranged killer who set out to enact his own twisted actions on the children of Staten Island after his whole family was killed in a tragic accident. Now, another variation of the legend occurs at a summer camp within the same confines of what I just described. His family dies in a horrible accident, and this sets him over the edge. However, the most widely recognized version of the Cropsey legend is perhaps the version that Cropsey was a deranged mental patient who had escaped and resided within the extensive tunnel system below Staten Island and in the abandoned and closed Willowbrook State School and Seaview Hospital. We will talk about both of these locations as well as they do play a role in the overall story of Cropsey. However, this legend would not stay localized to Staten Island. The legend would end up becoming the influence for the slasher film The Burning, which would be released in 1981. Now, the film, piggybacking off the success of other slashers and perhaps most notably being Halloween that came out in 1978, The Burning depicted Cropsey, spelt without the E, as a camp counselor who had been burned in a horrible prank by other counselors and seeks revenge upon them. In the movie, Cropsey would receive numerous surgeries and skin grafts, and 5 years after the prank, he would return to the camp that wronged him and enact revenge. However, instead of the urban legend Cropsey, who is sometimes associated with either a hook for a hand, much like the Candyman, who was also of slasher movie fandom, or either a bloody axe. In the movie version of Cropsey, these were scrapped entirely, with the movie version opting for a pair of gardening shears as his weapon of choice. Now, while the legend of Cropsey was widely regarded throughout the time to the people of Staten Island as a myth, generated to help scare kids into not venturing into the properties of Willowbrook State School or the Seaview Hospital late at night, or venturing into the dark woods on Staten Island. However, this legend would take a turn into reality. As the late 80s rolled around, the legend would become real when kids mysteriously started vanishing on Staten Island. But before we dive into that, we need to take a slight turn and discuss the dark cloud that hung over Staten Island well before these kids would start going missing, and that would be the cloud that is Willowbrook State School. Opening in 1938, the Willowbrook State School was primarily used as a school for children with developmental disabilities. For a brief time, it was used as an army hospital during World War II, before being converted back to the Willowbrook School. During its tenure on Staten Island, conditions within Willowbrook started to get worse. The patients and students swelled in numbers with a pure lack of staff to take care of them all, in addition to the possible human rights abuses going on behind closed doors at the school as well. In 1965, Robert F. Kennedy toured the Willowbrook State School after hearing the rumblings of what was going on behind closed doors. RFK would go on to describe the school as a quote-unquote snake pit, and the living conditions were putrid. They would be compared to that of people in cages would be living better than these kids were. The tour done by RFK would raise awareness about the school, or better wording would be that this was kind of a cesspool of neglect that these kids were facing on a day in and day out basis. In 1972, a doctor who worked within Willowbrook had slipped a key to a local reporter named Geraldo Rivera, who brought a camera and snuck inside the facility and filmed what they saw for the whole world to see. Children, many wearing little to no clothes, being neglected, covered in their own feces, and sleeping on the floor. While many cared about the work they were doing and were passionate about it, other workers delighted in the opportunity to neglect these poor children. It was cruel, dangerous, and disgusting. In addition to this, rumors spread that Willowbrook was conducting experiments on the kids residing there and injecting them with hepatitis, which would go on to spread wildly and infect many of the students. The Willowbrook State School would be renamed the Staten Island Developmental Center in 1974, and many people pushed for the closure of the building entirely. And while the slow process of removing the kids out of the school took time, ultimately the school would not be closed for good until nearly a decade after Geraldo Rivera's stunning newscast shed light on the people of New York what was truly going on. By 1987, the school was finally closed for good, and it was the abandoned skeletons of this building and the buildings around it, nestled in the dark forests of central Staten Island, would the Cropsey legend take a deep hold. Now, for us to understand how the real-life version of this story takes place, we first need to learn a brief little bit about a man named Andre Rand. Andre Rand, born as Frank Russian, was born on March 11th, 1944 in Manhattan, and would grow up in Ithaca and would go on to serve in the Army in the 60s. Beyond that, what we know about his childhood and how he was raised remains a big question mark. However, what we do know is this. Rand's dad died when he was 14, and his mom was committed to Pilgrim State Asylum in Long Island. At one point, this was the largest mental institution in the world. However, it does not seem like Andre Rand was abused or neglected as a child, and a woman claiming to be Rand's sister in the Cropsey documentary confirmed this as well and said that they were never abused as a child, and obviously that her father passed away. When Rand was 14, his mother lived most of her life within a mental asylum, and she was not very present within Andre's life. However, from 1966 to 1968, Rand, who was still going by Frank at this point in his life, would work at the Willowbrook State School as a custodian. And of course, we just did a little history recap on what that place was like. However, Rand would not work at Willowbrook for too long and would leave well before the place would close in the late 80s. But once he left his job at Willowbrook, this is when he would officially change his name over to Andre Rand. And it would not take long after him leaving his job to start getting into some illegal and questionable things. It would start on May 25th, 1969, when Rand would lure a 9-year-old girl into his car and kidnap her. Now, a police officer happened to see the events unfold when the girl was lured into Rand's car, and the officer followed Rand to a vacant lot and caught him in the act before a sexual assault could take place. Now, Rand would be arrested and eventually convicted with this attempted assault charge and spend 16 months in prison. Now, it would be shortly after these 16 months, it would be when some children would start to go missing from Staten Island. However, it is important to note that Rand would only be charged for some of these crimes. However, it is widely believed that he could have had a hand in a large majority of these cases that I'm about to detail. On July 7th, 1972, Alice Pereira vanished while she was playing in the lobby of the building her family lived in. Alice would seemingly vanish without a trace, and naturally the police had a hunch that perhaps Andre Rand had something to do with her disappearance. It had been found that Rand, during the time of Alice's disappearance, would be working as a maintenance man within the building. This would, of course, provide him ample time to potentially stalk the victim. This would also take place only a short distance from the Willowbrook State School, in an area where Rand would sometimes make his home through a variety of makeshift campsites he would make in the woods, some being very close and being around the Willowbrook State School. Later on, fast forward to 1981, Rand would attempt to lure a 9-year-old girl into his Volkswagen, and the girl would run, and Rand would follow her home. Although no charges were ever pressed in that incident, it kind of continues to paint a picture of who truly Andre Rand was in his behavior. Also in 1981, July 15th, 1981 to be specific, 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes would disappear after going down the block to pick up a bar of soap from the Port Richmond Deli in Staten Island. Now, witnesses had come forward claiming that they had seen Rand's car in the area of where Hughes had gone missing, many of which claims did not come out years after her disappearance. However, Rand would not be arrested in connection with this case just yet. Now, in 1983, Rand would try to pull off a brazen stunt, for lack of a better word, and this would put him firmly on the radar within the NYPD as someone who was a troubled individual who had the potential to commit crimes against children. Again, people had hunches, but at this point, no concrete evidence connecting Rand to any kidnapping or crime against children, with the exception, of course, of the attempted assault case years earlier. In 1983, Rand would pick up 11 children from a local YMCA and take them to White Castle before taking them to Newark Airport. What he was planning on doing with these kids remains very unclear, and he would end up returning these kids to the YMCA 5 hours later. However, Rand would be arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment and serve 10 months in jail. Now, shortly after being released from jail, 11-year-old Tyhese Jackson would disappear from her neighborhood on Staten Island. And then lastly, in 1984, 22-year-old Hank Gafforio would disappear. Hank was known as a nice guy throughout the neighborhood, but suffered from mental challenges and a low IQ. Some have stated that his brain capacity was that of a 15-year-old boy and not a 22-year-old. In addition to these disappearances, you have other disappearances that have occurred on Staten Island within this time period that sometimes gets affiliated with this entire case and with Andre Rand, like the disappearance of 18-year-old Audrey Lynn Nuremberg in 1977 and the disappearance of 42-year-old Ethel Louise Atwell, a former employee of Willowbrook State School. However, the 4 cases I discussed, Alice Pereira, Holly Ann Hughes, Tyhese Jackson, and Hank Gaforio, are the commonly affiliated victims of Andre Rand that would remain cold for many years until 1987. July 7th, 1987. Jennifer Schweiger, a 12-year-old girl born with Down syndrome, would be reported missing after going on a walk near her home. A grueling 35-day search would be launched to try and find Jennifer. During this time, witnesses had come forward claiming to see Andre Rand walking with Jennifer towards the area of Willowbrook State School. Rand would be arrested based on the eyewitness sightings, and initially Rand would claim that he would never have met Jennifer. However, when all the eyewitness testimonies would make their way back to Rand's lawyer, they would change their stance. However, it would not matter. While Rand was in custody, the body of Jennifer Schweiger would be found in a shallow grave near the Willowbrook State School. In addition to this, they would find a small campsite in the woods near Willowbrook as well that belonged to Andre Rand. In 1988, Rand would be charged with the kidnapping of Jennifer Schweiger, but the jury could not reach a verdict on the murder charge, and ultimately Rand was not charged with murder, just the kidnapping charge, and was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. After the conviction of Rand, investigators started looking deeper into the possible connections that he could have had in regards to the cases of Alice Pereira, Holly Ann Hughes, Tyhese Jackson, and Hank Gaforio, and there were connections. Many of these children suffered from mental disabilities, and this was a trend that was evident throughout the disappearances of these children. However, most of the evidence was eyewitness testimony, which can be unreliable at best. Fast forward to the 2000s, there was a renewed interest in the Holly Ann Hughes case when numerous people came forward and claimed that Andre Rand was with Hughes the night she disappeared, and the reason they had not come forward previously was because of their connections with drugs and other related things of that nature. They did not want to become involved because there could have been the possibility that they themselves could have been arrested for drug charges, so many stayed silent until decades later when they got sober. In addition to this, you had a young woman who came forward and stated that when she was 6 years old, she lived across from the Port Richmond Deli and saw Rand take Holly Ann Hughes into his green Volkswagen. Eventually, in 2004, Rand would be tried for the kidnapping of Holly Ann Hughes, fresh off this evidence of the new sightings coming forward. Of course, nobody to this day has been found. No evidence or the body of Holly Ann Hughes has been found, so it is only possible that Rand at this point could have been charged with the kidnapping charge, as there was no evidence to show that Holly Ann Hughes, of course, had been murdered. Now, Rand would be found guilty of the kidnapping charge, and since there was no statute of limitations on first-degree kidnapping in the state of New York, that could not affect the sentencing. Rand would be sentenced to an additional 25 years to life behind bars. This would make Andre Rand finally eligible for the possibility of parole in 2037. Now, if this were to happen, and if he were to make it that far, he would be 93 years old. Although this might be where the story of Andre Rand ends, it is not the end of the information I was able to recover in regards to this case. Now, watching the Cropsey documentary, not everyone is or was convinced that Rand was the killer in these cases. Another possible suspect that emerged in the case was a man named Bob Graham, but from what I watched in the documentary, it does not elaborate on Graham's potential ties in as a suspect. Now, it is true that numerous people lived in the woods around Willowbrook, not just Rand. Rand had a variety of friends that he would often associate with. A lot of times they would stay together in the tunnels underneath Willowbrook. Some have theorized that Rand could have been framed for this because of his previous crimes against children and would have made a perfect target to be framed by possibly one of these other homeless people that he interacted with at Willowbrook State School or on Staten Island. However, the coincidences are almost too much in that regard that paint Rand as the main suspect for the 5 disappearances we have that are commonly attributed to him. In addition to this, retired NYPD detective Leonard D. Alessandro, oh my gosh, I butchered that, I apologize. Leonard D. Alessandro states in the Cropsey documentary that he felt like Rand was kidnapping these children and passing them around to his friends. the fellow homeless that he would have stayed and interacted with, and that he passed these children around to them, and that these people just happened to share the same sick views that he did against children. Now, we cannot confirm nor deny this. However, if true, it would paint an even worse picture of what could have happened to these children. Detective D'Alessandro would continue and state that there was another rumor that Rand would dig up dead bodies and have intercourse with them. And that was a kind of not so well kept secret about him that was spread throughout the community. However, again, that seems to tiptoe the edge of what is real and what isn't, and whether or not these could be lies made up to tarnish Rand's character even further. Now, you also have rumors regarding Rand's involvement with possible satanic rituals, and that maybe this was something he was involved with. However, to counter the idea or the claims that Andre Rand was involved with some type of satanic rituals, this was the 1980s that we were talking about, and this was the peak of the satanic panic movement. And although this was happening during this time, it was true, people were worshiping Satan during this time. A lot of true crimes that would take place during this time would be kind of lumped in with the satanic panic movement, even though there was very little evidence to support it. These were just kind of lumped in because this was something that people were genuinely scared about. However, there was no extensive connection to any of these. So whether or not Andre Rand was involved with satanic rituals, we don't really know. However, cult material would be mailed to the home of Jennifer Schweiger, and a letter that was mailed to the family, claiming that Rand was supplying children to the Church of the Process, a religious group that is basically equal parts religion and cult, with their beliefs teetering on the edge of what many would consider satanic worship. Now, this would be the same group that David Berkowitz, aka the man responsible for the Son of Sam murders, would claim to be acting on behalf of and helped him commit the crimes. However, this letter would not be mailed by Rand himself. Instead, the anonymous letter sent to the Schweiger family would be traced back to Veronica Lukin, a woman who has her own small religious-type following. Director of the Cropsey documentary Joshua Zeman would try to interview Veronica, and a member of her group stated that Veronica had a vision of Andre Rand not being the killer of Jennifer Schweiger, but rather him delivering her to the quote-unquote coven of devil worshippers, and continued and stated that she had visions of her being on a table and satanic high priests were sticking knives into Jennifer. However, again, there is no evidence to support this, except with this medium-like vision that cannot be proven. Now, while the idea of Rand being this satanic devil worshipper could be true, there is nothing to prove it, and seems more like a case of people attaching a motive behind his crimes that was in the news at the time, as opposed to perhaps the true motive as to why he kidnapped these children. However, included with the documentary was a possible motive for Rand's actions. Reverend Charles Musket, who housed Rand during the days leading up to the Schweiger trial, stated in an interview in the documentary that Rand had confessed to the kidnapping of Jennifer, and stated that he had a strong dislike of people who were mentally handicapped, and that they shouldn't be alive. Rand believed that these children came from families that did not love them or wanted them, and viewed them as less than the average person. Whether or not that is truly the motive for Rand's actions remains a little foggy, but it is something to go with. Why he felt that way is another story entirely. Perhaps it could have been a perfect storm of things. Rand's father passing away young, his mother being institutionalized, him working and seeing the atrocities at Willowbrook State School, and perhaps all of these things shaped his mind into having a different perception on the world, and especially a different view on those who are mentally handicapped. 2 NYPD detectives leading up to the Schweiger trial had showed Andre Rand the video done by Geraldo Rivera over the atrocities at Willowbrook, and Rand stated that he had never seen the documentary, or this video done by Geraldo Rivera, and the detective said that they would show it to him as they were staying in a hotel before the trial. Rand would be shown this tape, and while watching it, he would become very emotional, and state that the staff at Willowbrook were victims too, and during the showing of this video, his behavior would become very strange. His eyes would roll back in his head, he would start drooling, and become nonverbal until the following morning. Now again, I encourage you all to watch the documentary, as it does not do everything justice that I'm talking about, but again, I am very grateful that I watched it for this week's episode, and it gave me a lot of extensive knowledge that I would not have found otherwise, so I definitely suggest checking it out if you are a fan of true crime documentaries and things like that. Now, in conclusion, while we don't have a traditional theories section for this week's episode that you returning listeners might be used to, Andre Rand, the real boogeyman of Staten Island, is an example of an urban legend becoming all too real and taking on a life of its own. Now, while there might not be a bloody axe-wielding man hell-bent on vengeance living in the tunnels underneath Staten Island, the real Cropsey was among the general population all along. Andre Rand, a man possibly shattered from early trauma and misconceptions about the mentally handicapped, took those beliefs to the extreme and did horrible things to those he felt shouldn't be here anymore. There is nothing more of a monster than that. Crimes against children are some of the worst, and targeting those who are even more vulnerable doubles down on that idea. While Rand is currently rotting in prison, we only have to hope that the families of Alice Pereira, Tyheese Jackson, and Hank Gafforio get closure, and that their bodies are finally recovered after all these years. While the urban legend of Cropsey still exists in the history books in Staten Island, the dark cloud that once permeated this New York borough through Rand's reign of terror is something that will haunt this community forever, and shows that perhaps the scariest things out there are not the fictional boogeyman, but mankind itself. Now, with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode. I kind of ended there on a little bit of I'd say a mysterious note. Trying to work on that. Trying to end my episodes in a really kind of suspenseful way, and I felt like I ended that pretty good. So feel free to let me know. Again, not a traditional theories section for this week, because obviously we know who did it. Of course, we do not have all of the answers when it comes to this case, when it comes to the case of Andre Rand, but this happens to be one of those cases where you have a deep-rooted urban legend and kind of a real-life story to back it up. Of course, you have some urban legends, that walk that tightrope between being real and being fictional, and maybe some little stories here and there that were true that influenced the legend. This legend has a genuine, true, horrifying tale to accompany it, and to be honest with you, this is not something that I had heard about prior to researching it. And I'm kind of surprised I haven't, because this seems very significant of a true crime case. And this is very interesting to research again. All of those of you listening, if you are interested in true crime documentaries, again, I definitely suggest you check out the Cropsey documentary. It's very, very good. Helped me out tremendously for this episode and gave me a lot more background information that I did not originally have. So a lot of credit goes out to them for all the work that they did on that documentary. Very good, and I used it extensively for this week's episode. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. This year's Halloween episode, not releasing directly on Halloween, but the week of Halloween, so it counts a little bit. Again, that is going to do it for this week's episode over Cropsey, the Staten Island Boogeyman. I hope you all enjoyed it. Something spooky, true crime, urban legend, kind of a big old mashup of everything for this year's Halloween episode, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Feel free to let me know in the comments whether or not you enjoyed this episode, whether you think Andre Rand was responsible for all the deaths in this case. Feel free to let me know. Feel free to go ahead and follow me on all my socials, Instagram, TikTok. Go and check me out on YouTube or Spotify, wherever you're listening to that to. Follow, subscribe, whatever you got to do. Share it with everybody else that you feel like is interested in this type of content or the type of content that I do. Feel free to share it, get the word out. I greatly appreciate the support, and I cannot thank you all enough. But last but not least, that will finally do it, and I will see you all on the next one.